Welcome everybody. It gives me great delight to introduce Dr. Pippa Simmonds to talk about her PhD topic today, which is ruminant livestock and climate change in the UK livestock sector. I'll leave you to fill any gaps with that introduction, Pippa, but I suspect you'll just want to crack on with your presentation, so we can interrogate you later. Please do put any questions in the chat as we go along. We'll have the usual format, so Pippa will present for about half an hour or so, and we'll have questions and discussion afterwards.
Perfect. Hi everyone. I'll just sort out my screen sharing. Give me a couple of seconds because it's been a little slow this morning.
We've just had a little rehearsal and it just takes a while for Pippa's computer to... There we go.
Excellent. Got it? Yeah, great.
Yes, yeah, we're all there. Good. Over to you, Pippa.
All right, perfect. I'm just going to start a little timer here so I know what's happening. Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. It's really nice to see some familiar faces and some new faces. So I'm going to talk about my PhD today, which I finished just there in the spring, and it's about ruminant livestock and climate change and the UK livestock sector's discourses and practices pertaining to this topic. So back to basics, when we're talking about ruminants, we mean animals with a rumen, and for the purposes of this PhD, that is largely cows and sheep. And ruminants have this very ingenious way of digesting cellulose, which is the tough plant matter, plant fiber that we struggle to digest. And they do that with the help of the bacteria that are in the rumen. Now, the byproduct of this process is methane, which they then belch out. And this contributes approximately a third of anthropogenic methane emissions, which is the topic of contention, because methane is a potent greenhouse gas. And many of you will have seen this graphic before. It's just to illustrate that we tend to focus a lot more now on things like land use change and on-farm processes, and enteric fermentation would come into that category that's shown in that sort of beige color there of on-farm processes. Whereas transport tends to be a lower proportion of emissions from our food. So as you can see, beef and lamb are sort of up the top there, not looking too great. Chocolate also not looking too great, but unfortunately that's not what I'm talking about today. So in the UK, we've had this real drive to produce a lot of food ever since World War II, and that's been supported by various policies, including the EU Common Agricultural Policy. Since Brexit, we've seen the CAP being phased out, and we've seen that basic payment scheme under the CAP being phased out, which is disproportionately impacting beef and sheep farms in less favoured areas. So typically the kind of upland beef and sheep, kind of smaller farms. Replacing the CAP, we've got the Environmental Land Management Scheme in England, the subject of a great deal of uncertainty over the last few years, but particularly in the year when I was doing my data collection, so 2022. And then in Wales, it's devolved, so they're looking at the Sustainable Farming Scheme. And so my participants were based in England and Wales. Now, the aim of the PhD was to explore how the UK ruminant livestock sector was responding to this bigger problematization of ruminants and climate, and this idea that cows and sheep were, contributing significantly to climate change. So I was interested in how stakeholders were understanding these interactions between cows and sheep and climate, but also what kind of solutions were being proposed and implemented. And I'll close that loop kind of at the end of the presentation, as you'll see. So these are my specific objectives. We don't really need to read those, but just to say that I started off looking at discourses in news media to kind of pick up on those broader societal discourses that were going on before kind of zooming in and speaking to people, stakeholders within the livestock sector and livestock farmers a lot more specifically. And finally, I was interested in the potential implications for policy making, which I'll outline at the end of the presentation. So when I delved into the literature on this, I came out with a few different knowledge gaps. So firstly, that there hadn't been a great deal of empirical engagement with livestock farmers on this topic, and particularly not in a participatory way, so using participatory methods. There's been a lot of different media analyses that relate to this, but there hadn't been comparison directly between national level news media and livestock farming news media. And more broadly, there were these calls from the academic community to better engage agricultural actors in these discussions around the role of livestock in sustainable food systems. So the literature review, I divide into sort of three main themes. So when you look into literature that relates to this topic, a big chunk of it is very consumer focused. So this is the kind of work around sustainable diets, around this idea of people consuming less meat, and this as a solution for this issue of methane emissions. So I've illustrated that there with the Eat Lancet diet, which was obviously very influential in that space. And I've kind of included under that things like cultured meat as well. So this idea about sort of moving away from living farm animals, although I don't focus on that too heavily within the thesis. Another theme is producer focused. So this tended to be these quite sort of techno-scientific approaches, different tweaks that could be made to existing systems, and particularly suited sometimes to more intensive systems. I've just put a little illustration along the bottom there, which is actually from Australia, which is why it talks about savanna burning. But it kind of shows you a lot of the other ones. So things like genetics, things like manure management and feed additives as different ways to reduce the relative emissions coming from relative emissions per kilo of product, basically. And then finally, there's the more systems focused approach, which tended to get a lot more theoretical and a bit less empirical. I think I talk about that in relation to things like agroecology, which have this focus not just on practices, but also on kind of power imbalances and things like food sovereignty. But most of the sort of kind of theories and things like that, I then talk about as I build my conceptual framework, which I'm going to show you now. So let me talk through this. The central guiding principle of the thesis is discourse. So I understand discourses to be stories that are power-laden and persuasive. So very much in the tradition of kind of critical discourse analysis. And I kind of abbreviate discourses pertaining to this topic as methane discourses. And I'm interested in these methane discourses and their associated practices. Now, a very influential, a big influence on this was Campbell's work looking at farming ontologies. So he's interested in the agency of the farm and bringing in this kind of more than human perspective. But he also had a political aspect to it and drew on political economy to think about the farm's connection with the broader supply chain and with the wider world. So I create this nexus of farming ontologies, epistemology, and farming identities. Now, in terms of epistemology, the influential paper there was Carolan's work, thinking about epistemic distancing and how the sort of different ways of seeing things, I suppose, between conventional and alternative agriculture. And then farming identities, I very much draw on Burton's work on The Good Farmer, which obviously talks about this more productivist identity and uses ideas around symbolic interactionism to look at what are the symbols of a good farmer. Classically, his work is about people having very tidy hedgerows and neat rows of wheat in their fields. So that's the main part of it. But then, as I mentioned before, I want to bring in these societal discourses. I don't know why I'm pointing at my screen. That's not helpful for you guys. The societal discourses up on the top right there. And the main kind of theory that I filter that through is the discourses of climate delay. So these things that aren't directly denying climate change, but are seeking to delay action. And then I also think about lock-in in relation to the the UK agri-food supply chain as well. So that then filters through into my chosen methodology. As I hinted before, I started off with some media analysis, which I'll talk about in just a second. And then I conducted a series of interviews with livestock sector stakeholders. So that was people including industry representatives and NGOs, vets, processors, retailers, policymakers, trying to get a broad spectrum of different perspectives there. And I then conducted 32 interviews with livestock farmers. And of those, the aim was for them to be walking interviews. We managed 24 walking, and then for various logistical reasons, the rest of them were either online or over the phone. So I then conducted a Photovoice project, and that was with 8 livestock farmers who I'd previously interviewed. And we got together, we did 4 online workshops over the course of about a month to deliver that. So for my media analysis, I begun with critical discourse analysis based on Carvalho's approach from her 2008 paper. So just to give you the numbers, I ended up finding a corpus of 996 relevant articles, and that was from the years 2016 through to 2021. Obviously, couldn't analyze all of those, so I identified these critical discourse moments, and you'll see that abbreviated here as CDM, which are situations or happenings where the discourses shift and change in response. So I ended up with this focus corpus of 154 articles, which I went on to analyze using Carvalho's approach. This shows you the increasing salience of this topic. So initially, this wasn't really in either national media or farming media, or it was relatively infrequent. But we can see that that really increased in the sort of latter half of that study period. So particularly from January 2019 onwards, that's when the Lancet Commission was published. It's also when there was a Climate Change Committee report on land use that got a lot of coverage too. What I am trying to show here is the different critical discourse moments and how they map over time. So at the bottom, you will see the years, the timeline. The little arrows are showing some of the significant happenings. I couldn't fit them all on, but there's a selection of them. You probably remember a lot of these. And then the kind of fuzzy rectangular boxes are showing how the different critical discourse moments stretched over those years. And we've got the first one, which is where there was that really time of low salience, but you've got quite different discourses happening in the mainstream media, the farming media. Then in critical discourse moment 2, there's this really strong prevalence of discourses around radical restraint and we must eat less meat. And the example I've got here, which is meat is harmful to planetary health. That's primarily taking place in the national media. And then you've got the backlash, if you will, from the farming news media, which is talking about fighting the anti-meat agenda. And in that, you've got this strong discourse of us versus them. And it's very much centered around these kind of incidents that were happening in like the second half of 2019. And then finally, you've got another change in the shift in the discourse around COP26, and I won't go into in too much depth here. Just a couple of example quotations. This idea that, the kind of mainstream media, and particularly The Guardian, would be taking things like Eat Lancet Commission as very legitimate, as something that we need to do. And then later in the year, we saw this interesting turn when there were the severe wildfires in the Amazon. And that was the first time you kind of saw it, that being linked to UK consumption habits and that kind of responsibilization of the UK consumer. Turning to the farming media and this critical discourse moment of fighting the anti-meat agenda, it was mostly spoke about as anti-meat, but in the first quote, you can see that shifts to anti-farming. So the kind of focus is not just on the products, but it's on the people. It's very much felt as this very personal attack. And then there's this quote just illustrating that farmers are experiencing this unfair amount of blame. And this quote starts to get at something called whataboutism, which I'll come back to a little bit later in this presentation. So I'm going to turn now to my chapters that draw on the interviews and the photo voice all together. And I start off by thinking about farming ontologies and farming identities. So I haven't spoken very much about my sample here, actually, so I'm going to take this opportunity to do that. I think it's important to note at this point that this is a qualitative piece of work, so it's not intended to be generalizable. However, it's worth bearing in mind that on the spectrum of conventional to alternative agriculture, I would say a higher proportion of my participants erred on that alternative side. I also had a higher proportion of women in my sample compared to the DEFRA statistics on like the number of women in the farming sector. And yeah, I think I would interpret these data with interpret these findings with that in mind, and I can touch on that a bit more at the end. So when I spoke to people more directly about what makes a good farmer, the qualities that came through were around empathy, it was around being a good business person, and also being open to change. And this meant that as I analysed the data, I found that there were these visual symbols, very similar to Burton's previous work. And being a good livestock farmer was very much about having visibly healthy livestock, because that shows that one is both responsive to their needs, but also that one can make money from them because healthy livestock is more profitable, basically. I've also put this little question mark around open to change, because this was very much within the framework of conventional to alternative farming, and I'll touch on that again a bit later. But it was this idea of, oh, we do things a little bit differently, and a lot of people kind of critiquing that that perceived lack of willingness to change in the sector, and people passing things down through generations rather than coming in with new ideas. New ideas more often being around things like technology, for example, but also particularly around regenerative agriculture, which I'll come back to again later. So I don't think I said this already, but the majority of the pictures in this presentation are from my Photovoice presentation. So when you see a really nice picture, it's them and it's not mine. So yeah, this is just to illustrate some of those couple of illustrative quotes in terms of that someone talking about the kind of sixth sense of being a good stock person, and then also someone talking about their duty of care to the animals. And this kind of, I guess, feeds into what I'm going to say in the next slide. I'll just pause a moment and read those. Okay. So when we think about the ontology of farm, the ontology of being a farmer, it sounds so basic, but it is about living with animals who are experienced as lively agents. There's a reciprocity there in terms of needs. Like the farmer does need the animal in order to generate their livelihood, but there's also a sense that the animals very much need the farmer to respond to their needs for food, shelter, and safety. So it's very much about living one's life according to the animal's rhythms, and that the animals often will be actively resisting what you want them to do. That was very common. And that there could be these quite friendly relationships across these species lines. I've illustrated this here with this really nice dog picture, but this was with cows and sheep as well, not just the sort of more conventional companion animals. This is another quotation from the Photovoice, and I've just used this to mention quickly about that method. So it's about asking people to take photos and then coming together as a group to discuss them. It's brilliant because when people have a photo to talk about, they're so much more verbose than they would be otherwise. And you can really understand things a lot more deeply and get this much richer data. But I'm also showing photos from this out of context. The way that one does it for Photovoice is that you also have a caption, so you can understand the photographer's intention. Some people, if you just had the photo here, people might understand it differently, but they're explaining their perspective on it, what they're doing here, and what they're trying to say with this, really. And if you want to see all the photos and their captions, I've got a link at the end of the presentation for the digital gallery. So coming now to methane discourses. And yeah, I'll just say, so I have a non-farming background, so it was really important to do that initial sort of work and that work to understand what does it mean to be a livestock farmer, rather than just coming in with my own assumptions and try to interpret things in that way. So thinking about methane discourses, is the main, I guess, the main sort of findings from my PhD. The first approach to this was to dispute the problem. So there was a degree of climate skepticism present, or what I'm calling climate skepticism. So that's that ruminants do not impact the climate. And that came out through their emissions don't matter, they're being measured incorrectly, and that methane from ruminants is in some way different from methane from fossil fuels, that biogenic methane is irrelevant, whereas methane from fossil fuels is a potent greenhouse gas. But there was also climate delay, and that was the major kind of discourse that came through. And it was particularly this whataboutism. So we see that in Lamb's paper on the discourses of climate delay. They kind of illustrated it as being like, what about China? What about whatever? In this situation, it was much more about other sectors. So what about aviation? What about transport? So, and this was very much, people tended to talk about cities and people from cities who go on holiday a lot, who drive around a lot, and the fact that cities are visibly polluted in a way that their environment really wasn't. Yeah, so this quote illustrates a couple of those points. So the fact that you can't see the emissions coming from cows and sheep. And then also that, well, it doesn't really matter because of the potential to sequester carbon in grassland, which I'll talk about a little more in a couple of slides. Part of this focus on ontology, I found it really helpful to look into literature on boundary making and understanding different kinds of boundaries and the way that these are very much discursively constructed. So I thought a lot about the spatial boundaries of the farm, and I tended to think about it, what kind of I can add to this is about the vertical boundaries of the farm. So this quote is from a farm where they were on a flight path, so we were really like commenting on just the sheer number of planes going overhead. But this was relatively common in interviews, to look up and be like, oh, look, there's a plane, and to relate that to what we were talking about. So yeah, you can see that planes are emitting, but you can't really see that that's happening with cows. And that kind of spoke to this idea of how we separate down here from up there, things that are happening at our kind of surface level versus things that are happening at the atmospheric level. And a component of this is that invisibility of methane emissions. So they're invisible to our senses, I suppose, particularly visually, similar to work on air pollution, but they're also like ontologically invisible as well. We don't really conceptualize the air super well. It's like a fish thinking about the water in which it swims. Like as we move through the air, we don't necessarily think about its components per se. I also had a big focus on social boundaries, and two of the main ones that came through were between farmers and non-farmers, and between farmers and decision makers. So firstly, there was this, and this is, well documented in the literature, this disconnect came through between farmers and the non-farming public. And that was very much, I'd say, an imagined public, the public that they would read about in newspapers and things like that. There was that feeling of people as being quite ignorant of the ways of the countryside, associated with cities, and associated with a lot of emissions as well. And you kind of contrast that with people's reaction to people walking through their farm, which was often relatively friendly, and often involved them being keen to speak to people about what they were doing. Now, in terms of decision makers, farmers very much associated, the farmers in my research very much associated decision makers with the urban, with having a lot more power than them. and with not understanding their way of life, particularly not understanding rural issues. So this first quotation is about people being out in farmland, and that they need to understand it's not a playground, it's a working landscape. So ontologically, the farm was a place of work, it was a place for generating revenue rather than a place for leisure, which is how those of us that are non-farmers might experience it. And then this second one is illustrating that idea that the people who are making decisions about this, the people who are, particularly those who are advocating this meat reduction kind of discourse, are very much associated with the city and very much associated with, you know, having more power than those living in the countryside. So, oh yeah, I had to put a poo photo in there somewhere. It always comes up during the Photovoice. So when it comes to the solutions, at the beginning, I said my aims were one of my aims was to think about the solutions that were being implemented. But by and large, we were operating at the problem level of political discourse. We weren't really thinking about solutions that much. And it was only really through a lot of me sort of probing and prompting that we got to talk about these things. So in terms of these very methane specific solutions, so things like feed additives, for example, people just generally saw them as pointless. You know, the methane isn't a problem. So why would you need to do this? Why are you going to make me pay for something that is unnecessary and give me extra work? And also, in the case of those that were farming more extensively, it doesn't really apply. You know, there isn't a way to deliver it yet. So, well, there wasn't at the time. So it just didn't feel relevant. We also talked about approaches that related to efficiency. And in that, I included things like genetics, which came through very strongly, using carbon calculators, and animal health as well to a lesser extent. So this idea of efficiency is about reducing your relative emissions. So reducing your emissions per kilo of product. And that lends itself really well to systems in which you can measure things very tightly. So it does tend to favor more intensive systems, and the supply chain really like it, especially if you've got a contract with a retailer, because then they can get some numbers that say that they're reducing their Scope 3 emissions. Regenerative agriculture doesn't necessarily have a lot to say about methane, but it's much more about its contribution, I suppose, to the topic of ruminants in climate is about the way that ruminants help to support carbon sequestration in the soil. So there's been some literature to say that this is disruptive in the farming sector. You know, it's like really questioning a lot of these social symbols of the good farmer, like tidy fields, like neat hedgerows and things like that. But it's not particularly radical. It doesn't have a strong kind of political foundation to it. It's not really, it's kind of saying buy this, not this, rather than saying let's do food systems completely differently. And it's also the ability of soil to sequester carbon is much more talked up, I suppose, outside of the peer-reviewed literature. And that might just be due to like us not having ways to measure it well enough yet, but by and large, that is the consensus at the moment. You can build up soil carbon if you've had some arable land, say, and you put it back to pasture, you'll increase the soil carbon until it reaches equilibrium, and then it will just kind of, you know, continue to balance itself out rather than constantly sucking in carbon, as the phrase that some of my participants used. I've actually got that there. So yeah, this is this idea that because of having the cows there and them eating the grass, that then that land is constantly removing carbon from the atmosphere. And then I've put this second one just to illustrate it's not just drawing on that kind of tacit knowledge and that kind of sensory knowledge around, okay, I can see this field is healthier because of the way the soil looks, the way the grass looks. It's also people are looking at scientific literature and they're mentioning specific authors. This was a conversation around GWP star, so the different way of measuring, assessing the potency of methane, basically, in terms of its global warming potential. So to conclude all of that, I'm saying that livestock farmers within my sample were drawing on these different kinds of knowledge, so scientific knowledge and tacit knowledge, to inform these methane discourses, which help to refute the threat to their identity, ontology, and epistemology. And these fall into 4 different categories. So valorizing ruminants and grassland in terms of carbon sequestration, denying that methane emissions from ruminants are a problem, promoting more farmer-led approaches. So that might be things like regenerative agriculture, but also technology came into that, like the sort of newer ways of slurry application, like trailing shoes and stuff, were considered to be quite farmer-led. And then also methane could be positioned as a side effect of efficiency. So a lot of people were making efficiency gains, especially 2022, the cost of inputs was really, really high. So people were doing things like direct slurry application to save money on fertilizer. They were trying to improve their animals' performance to get better returns. And they were sort of saying, well, if I'm doing that, that's going to be reducing my methane anyway. So to that point around efficiency, these are now moving on to the policy implications. You might think, okay, that's great. Here's a common language that farmers and policymakers can speak. We can just talk about efficiency and then they'll do stuff. Because obviously policymakers want to make farmers do stuff. However, and this is from the literature, that focus on relative emissions disregards absolute emissions. So it's reducing the emissions per kilo, but is it reducing the absolute overall emissions from the sector? Because often what happens, and this is called Gigon's paradox, is that when you make things more efficient, you end up consuming more overall, because obviously we are still in this system that encourages us to grow and to increase profits. So there's this risk of what we call rebound effects, where you're increasing the emissions overall. And that's been illustrated in different sectors and in different situations relating to land use and irrigation, things like that. And then also the point I would make is that while farmers are quite broadly aligned in terms of the way that they understand and talk about methane emissions, so that's across the spectrum, intensive, extensive, there are lots of differences in terms of practices. And those are for various different reasons, not necessarily driving towards reducing methane, but usually focused on other factors. The second implication is about understanding and working with these identities and ontologies. So I very much advocate towards the end of the thesis that we need better collaboration between farmers and non-farmers. And that goes both ways. It's not just a question of policymakers engaging farmers, but it's farming industry leaders engaging more with consumers, and particularly with people in urban areas who might struggle to access food, for example, and working to understand, the situation for people. So I think it's about optimizing different methodologies, including co-design and co-creation, to facilitate farmer involvement in the policy process. The people I spoke to were very interested in being involved and being consulted. But it's also, not having expectations that these kind of processes are going to lead to some miracle conversion. I can't remember where that's from, but that's somewhere in the literature. If someone's going in with policymakers need to understand where farmers are coming from and where them drastically changing their practices is going to require a massive change in terms of their underlying beliefs and their identity. And then I also talk about these potential frameworks for increased collaboration with the farming community. I'm a bit over time, so I won't go into these in depth, but I think most of us will know about looking at things through a food systems lens, but also thinking about just transitions and using different forms of justice to think through how we can move forward in a fair way while also reducing emissions. So the key takeaways, firstly, that climate delay and that there is this climate delay and livestock sector specific climate scepticism coming through in methane discourses. but also to be wary of these efficiency discourses, which might seem like an easy win, but aren't necessarily the best way forward. And the key message that I'd really like everyone to take away is about more and better collaboration going on between the livestock farming community and other actors. So thank you very much for listening. My email is there. Feel free to email me, and that's farmervoices.co.uk is the digital gallery where you can find all the Photovoice pictures and captions. I'll stop sharing there and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Pippa, very much. A great review of your PhD research, beautifully condensed into about 40 minutes or so. Anyway, questions, people. There's nothing in the chat that I can see, so if you want to raise your hand or pop something in the chat. Shall I kick off with one for you? Your recommendations at the end for more collaboration and between farmers and different sorts of stakeholders. Did you observe or come across any examples that you thought might, suggest some good practice out there that's already happening?
I'd say there were a couple of people that I spoke to who are already engaging quite a lot with policy. And again, I would say that's partly due to the sample, right? People who were up for talking to a researcher about climate change tend to be those who are quite engaged. And they were either contributing to sort of working groups and things with DEFRA and stuff like that, but also some of the stakeholders that I spoke to who had kind of multiple hats as farmers, but also as people who were engaged with policy as well. I think in terms of examples, I think what has informed me on that is our other work. So things like climathons and thinking about more deliberative processes and different ways to bring people together and how you deal with that trade-off between urgency and the need to get things done quickly, but also making sure that everyone is heard and that, you're not acting you're not rushing forward in something that unfairly impacts a particular group.
Thank you. Janet, go ahead.
Thank you, Pippa. Thank you for a fantastic presentation, really well structured, really well argued, and what seems to be a very thorough and thoughtful and thought-provoking piece of work. So wonderful. My question relates to that point that you made about efficiency and the absolute scale of emissions. And I wondered if you'd had any thoughts about how you build a kind of collaborative discourse around the absolute scale without it just looking like farmer bashing, because it's kind of, there's a lot of power and vested interest in that kind of debate about where the axe falls, if it's going to fall somewhere.
Yeah. No, thanks, Janet, for that kind feedback, and thank you for the question. I think that's kind of that's the really tricky thing, isn't it? Because a lot of this is tied, I didn't speak to this that much in the thesis, but a lot of this is experienced as a follow-on in terms of it's coming from the vegans, and it follows on from this sort of animal rights perspective that group who have historically had a very antagonistic relationship with livestock farmers have really latched onto this. There's an example of and it's difficult, but there's an example of an article that came up in, I think it was in Farmers Guardian, might have been Farmers Weekly, about when there was that blockade of that meat market in London, and they talk about them as climate campaigners, and they're not necessarily, they are, but they're specifically an explicitly vegan wing of Extinction Rebellion, who are a particular group with particular tactics. So it's this thing that climate's getting very much kind of coloured by these past experiences and these kind of antagonistic relationships that are there.
Yeah, I mean, it just strikes me as a challenge because in a sense, it's a common ground between the extensive upland livestock farmer and the vegan in this kind of focus on the absolute. But it makes for a very different, very difficult bedfellows, maybe.
Totally, yeah. Yeah, I wish I had a good answer to that. I think the other thing as well is that in relation to policymakers, it's kind of experienced as a follow-on from other things that have been really difficult. So things like non-point water pollution and TB, and this kind of distrust thing that like, well, actually, it was policy that told us to do a lot of this stuff in the first place and expand and take out the hedges. And now we're being told to put it all back. And, you know, how consistent is this new message going to be, really?
Thanks, Pippa. Lucy has a hand up. Over to you, Lucy.
Thanks, Pippa. That was super interesting. I just wanted to ask about something that you mentioned, but obviously didn't have time to kind of delve into, which is that impact of gender maybe on your findings. You mentioned your sample had more women than the DEFRA statistics might suggest. So I just wondered if you could speak a little bit about potential impacts of that.
Yeah, so I think there were probably a couple of reasons for that. I think it was partly my networks and who was willing to sort of talk to me. But it's also about who I felt brave enough to approach, for example. Like I went to an agricultural show at one point and I was like, I'm going to speak to lots of farmers. But then in the moment I was like overwhelmed by shyness and only really spoke to women because it was quite an intense environment. You know, that's just a one-off, but it is in some ways it can be this quite masculine environment. The thing that came through a lot was about good farming and what makes a good livestock farmer, and this quality of empathy was with different participants associated that with women, or they'd associate it with femininity, so being caring. And often like the trope is about women are really good at raising calves because they pay more attention and things like that. So some people talked about that as, you know, a truth and a thing, and other people said, oh, well, there's that stereotype. But actually, I just think it's about empathy, regardless of what gender you are and things like that. So it didn't end up being a sort of major component, I wouldn't say, in terms of that gender lens, but it was helpful to kind of talk it through and sort of bring it up specifically, because I looked at a lot of the sort of more feminist research during my literature review, particularly in relation to farming and farm succession and things like that.
Yeah, got a question from Chris in the room.
Pippa, thank you. That was really interesting. I just wondered if you found in your work sort of differentiation between farmers, because largely you talked about as if they're a homogenous group. I don't think you meant to, but we know they're not. So it's like a phrase that crops up is, it's not the how, it's the cow. No, it's not the cow, it's the how. I better get it the right way around. But so, you know, did your sample talk about sort of the bad eggs in the in the clutch, so to speak? You know, in other words, it's not me. I'm doing best I can, but there are other farmers who are really bad.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Chris. Yeah, I'm sorry if I do tend to fall into that trap of talking about farmers when I mean the farmers within my sample who in lots of ways. But yes, I think I talked about boundaries in the presentation, but one that I didn't talk about was like, intra-farming community boundaries. So there was particularly this strong one between livestock farmers and arable farmers, especially around soil carbon. It's like, you know, it's them that are releasing all the soil carbon, but they're also between the more alternative farmers and conventional farmers. So saying, you know, the conventional farmers are using loads of fertilizer, or they're doing things. Sorry, I just got distracted seeing the comment pop up. Yeah, that they're the problem, and actually with what we're doing is different. So yeah, there was some sort of farmer on farmer violence, if you will, but like they were much more likely to be express solidarity, I would say, even with farmers who were doing quite different things from them, because they felt as a sector quite threatened.
We've got time for a couple more. Tom, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. That was a really interesting talk. Thank you. So I had a similar question to Chris's, which was about this sort of methane denial, I guess. Was that kind of universally held among your sample of farmers, or were there any who were more accepting of, well, yeah, of the climate science, I suppose? And also, I wondered, I don't know if you mentioned this already, but your kind of non-farmer actors within the wider livestock system, were you able to tease apart what their views were on the methane problem, the processors and the retailers and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I'm going to answer the first one, and then you might have to remind me what the second one was because I'm bad at holding things in my brain. So the first one was about whether there were people who were more accepting of the kind of climate science perspective. Yeah, so yeah, that was the case. Definitely, I can think of definitely one person's coming to mind at the moment who was like, yeah, they do release methane, but we're doing all these other things that are beneficial. And actually, that's one of the discourses that came through that I didn't go into in the presentation, was it's about more than just methane. If you're just going to focus on this one thing, you're missing out on, say, biodiversity benefits, you're missing out on the broader sort of landscape benefits that ruminants can bring. So while people did, accept that it was having an impact and that things needed to be improved, they didn't necessarily see that as a reason to make any dramatic changes. And then the second one, that was about people who were non-farmers. And so there was quite a close Venn diagram in that a lot of the people who I spoke to who were livestock sector stakeholders as their main gig were also farming as well. So that was quite interesting. But I would also say that the ones who were more on the sort of agri-tech side, but also on the policy side, were a lot more focused on methane reductions, tending to view it through an efficiency lens, actually. Did that answer the question, or did I? Yeah?
Yeah, that was perfect. Thanks.
Okay, super. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got a question from Josh in the room, and then I'll note one from Jennifer, and then I think we'll have to draw it to a close. Josh.
Yeah, thank you, Pippa. Again, I echo the comments, really good work. And I think it's nice to, one, learn more about it, but two, note some of the parallels. I think on that, you spoke of regenerative agriculture as being disruptive, but not inherently radical. And I quite like that. And I thought, I guess, was there much said about, I guess, the tension between operating within a flawed system as opposed to advocating for that broader change? And was it seen as more of a palatable shift as a result of that? And then I guess, how does that link to the discourse and the role of its portrayal within acceptance in many ways?
Could you rephrase that? Because I feel like there was a few different bits to that I
I guess
not it together.
More just the point around the regen as being as a result of it being seen as disruptive but not radical. Was it seen as more palatable amongst the sample? And then I guess talking a little bit towards the discourse and your role, like your particular niche within that work.
Yeah, okay. So I guess the sort of disruptive but not radical is my assessment, right? So I think that participants saw it as actually quite radical, because it was really shifting away from a lot of these sectoral norms and really shifting away from these classic visual symbols, not symptoms, of good farming. But I think because of that, it is quite palatable, and it's palatable to people adopting those practices, I would say, but it's also palatable to people like me. I'm like, I was like, oh, this is actually really good, and like everyone's really positive, and that's nice. And that, it's sort of like they're like, I can't remember how I put it in the thesis, but it's like we're doing something with, improving things, and we're making money, because there's obviously in regen there's that big focus on you can increase your profit. So yeah, I think it's difficult. I know well, like there's all those issues with regen around how we define it, its potential to be used for greenwashing, and yeah, that thing when you've got something that's not very tightly defined, but obviously is good, and sometimes it's good that it's not tightly defined because people can apply it to different systems and, you know, use the bits that work for their system. It's obviously then it gets complicated and a bit messy. Does that answer the question? I haven't linked it to the discourses, have I?
No, I agree. And then I think in many ways, you mentioned that point around often regen's framed around as like narratives of hope. So it's a reorientation there as well. So no, I agree. I do think it was answered. But thank you. I'll pass to you at a later date again.
Great. Thanks, Josh.
Probably also worth noting that it specifically has livestock as one of its 5 principles as well, whereas other systems might be wanting to exclude them these days. It's the promising one that includes livestock.
Yes, yeah, and even in some cases, you know, people were saying we need more livestock to be able, you know, to be able to deliver this at a sort of country scale.
Jennifer.
Hi, thanks so much. That was a really interesting presentation, Philippa. I guess my question is related to this idea of, you know, talk around regenerative practices and the advent of regenerative principles as sort of modes of operation. But I wondered to what extent farmers were interested in like the monitoring and evidencing of those methane reductions, or more broad kind of climate adaptation strategies with livestock, and what kind of methods they might have expressed an interest in, or be already using. Like, you know, we see very high techie and quite low techie approaches to climate adaptation. So I just wondered what sort of things they were looking at for that evidencing that they're making change.
So specifically about evidencing methane reductions from the practices. Let me just think. I think that came through in relation to the carbon calculators. Again, a consistent frustration was with those was when they didn't include, there was an example of one not including hedgerows, and one of my participants saying, well, what about all these hedgerows I've planted? Like, how does that feed in? When I think about that sort of methane reductions, there were some farms, and there was one in particular I'm thinking of where there was a real focus on reducing the carbon footprint from the feed that they were using for this indoor beef system. And that was evidenced through things like daily weight gain and looking at the overall efficiency of the animals. In terms of evidencing methane reductions, like directly measuring that, I think one person mentioned in terms of genetics, these kind of, you know, fancy gadgets that they'll have to like put the animal into a box and be able to say, oh, this one, you know, produces less methane over a set amount of time, so this is the tup that we're going to use. But they weren't super interested in that, right? I think that's like, okay, if we can have a more efficient animal and like improve our genetics, big focus on genetics really, then methane reduction is a side effect of that. So
yeah, it's interesting sort of, the genetic advances has been sort of come into vogue recently, and I just wondered how they were thinking about kind of evidencing that and kind of rebutting some of the claims you were discussing earlier about sort of farmers being at the center of a lot of these controversies around climate change. So it was really interesting. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, I think like when people could do had done carbon calculations, often they were able to show a lot of sequestration, and they were, you know, I remember going to like an AHDB webinar, and they were like, we were really surprised at how high the emissions were from the cows actually, and they felt okay about it because it was balanced out from all the tree planting and stuff that they'd done. But you know, people are quite like, oh, it doesn't fit necessarily with the sort of discourses that are coming through.
Great, Pippa. Well, fantastic talk. Thank you. Another round of applause. And the recording of this session will be available on the CCRI YouTube site soon. So thank you, everybody, for contributing and for asking great questions. Thanks again, Pippa.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Pippa.
everyone. I'm just reading the chat.